speaking to us, Dr. Bonnie Huskins from the University of Adjunct Professor and Honorary Research Associate at the University of New Brunswick in Fredricton, and a part-time professor at St. Thomas University in Fredricton. And Bonnie teaches courses in the American Revolution and Loyalist history, Canadian history, immigration history, gender and women's history, the British Atlantic world, and pirates and piracy in world history. Her research interests include community formation amongst Loyalist newcomers to the Maritimes, untold stories of Loyalist women, Loyalist Freemasonry, 18th century sociability, biography, and the use of diaries as historical sources. She has been commissioned by Boydell Press to write a book tentatively titled An Engineer in Britain's Empire, the Professional and Personal World of British Military Engineer William Booth, 1748-1826. In May of this year, she was honored to receive the United Empire Loyalists Association of Canada designation of Honorary Fellow, along with Timothy Compo from Huron University College. And Bonnie is going to be talking today under the title of Examining Isabella Robbins, who lived in Lower Bedeck, through the lens of Loyalist women's history. So Bonnie, we welcome you to these talks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here. I don't know how I'm going to follow the dancers. That's a hard act to follow, but I'll give it my best. I'd like to thank, first of all, the Bedeck Area Historical Museum for the invitation, and also the University of New Brunswick for helping me with this talk as well. Before I get started, I just want to mention that I am indebted to a few scholarly sources. Of course, an island refuge that many of you know, but also the Loyalist Gazette, published by the United Empire Loyalist Association of Canada. Part of my women's stories was published in the second to the last issue. And also some of the women I'll be talking about are featured in a story map, which is a combination of a map-based narrative on the internet, which profiles individual Loyalists who resettled in New Brunswick. I really encourage you to go to that for an example of what can be done in terms of using the internet as a learning tool. So just Google New Brunswick Loyalist Journeys and you'll get a sense of what is possible. Before I start as well, I wanted to say thank you for sharing resources on Isabella, particularly Doug Sobey. I also have a big call out to my former student, Kaylee Curry from St. Thomas University. She was fabulous, as you all know. And also a former student of mine was a board member, is a board member, I understand, Sharon Layton. She was also a student of mine in a grad course at UNB. So a big shout out to those two. So, today I'd like to tell the story of Isabella Cole nee Robbins, who experienced the American Revolution in New Jersey and resettled with other Loyalists in Bedeck. But what I'd like to do today is, rather than focus just on her, I'd like to integrate her life history into the context of other Loyalist women's experiences. Indeed, this is the beginning of a new project where I'm trying to gather the stories of well-known and lesser-known Loyalist women who settled throughout the Maritimes. So if you have any ancestors, any female ancestors that you'd like to send my way, please just email me at bhuskins@unb.ca, and I'd be very happy to add them to my collection of Loyalist women. Now, the main question I want to answer today is what happens when we apply the concept of gender to war. Historian Lauren Duval has commented, and you have the quote here, that men and women experience warfare as gendered subjects. Putting gender at the center of our study of war can help us understand new perspectives and gain a fuller understanding of what it was like for men and women to endure the revolution and its consequences. Now, it is true that Loyalist women performed exceptional deeds during the American Revolution, like carrying intelligence, helping refugees escape, operating safe houses, and acting as nurses and camp followers. A few families even accompanied provincial regiments on campaign, witnessing the cries of the wounded and the death and capture of loved ones. That is not the case with Isabella or the other women profiled here. To understand their experiences and their roles, we must recenter the history from the front lines to the family and the household. We might be tempted to think that women were passive observers in their home spaces during the Revolution. But recent scholarship on the Revolution posits that households were extremely significant to the Revolution. But before we jump into Isabella's life, we should consider the issue of historical sources. Most female non-elites rarely told their own stories in their own words. We're often left with such sources as petitions, compensation claims, muster rolls, maps, and so on. And we must read them creatively and against the grain to gather enough information to catch a glimpse of these women. Thus, we're very, very lucky to have a written reminiscence from Isabella, which was transcribed, I understand, by her children before she died, and was published in Summerside's The Pioneer in 1896, and in a sketchbook by James McKinnon. Isabella's memories are also shared in Doris Munsey Haslam's The Rites of Bedeck, and in the wonderful poster that you see in the museum on Isabella Robbins. Now, Isabella's reminiscence is similar to that of Hannah Ingraham, initially from New York, who eventually resettled in Fredricton, New Brunswick. Like Isabella, Hannah recounted her experiences as an elderly woman. In her case, the wife of the local Church of England rector transcribed them. Early in the 20th century, M.V. Tippett, the rector's daughter, read her mother's transcription of Hannah's story to the Women's Historical Society in Toronto, and it was subsequently published in the Society's Transactions in the early 1930s. R.P. Gorham transcribed this version of Hannah's narrative. Like Isabella's memories, it was published in a newspaper, the St. John Telegraph, in 1933. However, the newspaper version differs in small details from the earlier published source. This is often the case with multiple transcribers and multiple editors. We also know in the case of Isabella's narrative that there are a few slight inaccuracies when corroborated with other sources, and they are pointed out in the poster in the exhibit. We also have to keep in mind that narrating a life in old age may privilege some memories over others. Nonetheless, it is rare to have Loyalist women recount their experiences in their own words. It's even more rare to have Loyalist women recite their childhood memories. Hannah was only 3 years old when the War of Independence broke out in 1776, while Isabella was 8 years old. Isabella and Hannah also narrate their memories of entering exile as young women. Hannah was 11 years old when she came to New Brunswick, while Isabella was 16 when she arrived in Quebec. So let's jump into Isabella's and Hannah's reminiscences. Hannah and her family lived on a farm in Concord, New York, when the American Revolution broke out. Hannah remembers, quote, "We had a comfortable farm, plenty of cows and sheep," unquote. According to Isabella, she was born in New Jersey in 1768, quote, "But our people had been in America a century prior to that date. My father, who was Richard Robbins, who was in a very comfortable circumstances, cultivated a farm near the town of Amboy, now known as Perth Amboy, and had a number of slaves, slavery being practiced at that time, as well as further south," unquote. So they both came from comfortable rural circumstances. Moreover, recent literature on the Loyalists and recent research, like again one of the wonderful posters in this exhibit, illustrates the Loyalists who had slaves during the American Revolution, some who brought slaves with them, although that wasn't a big number to PEI, and those who acquired slaves. Indeed, sources like Amani Whitfield's book, North to Bondage, and his article on slave life and slave law in colonial Prince Edward Island make it clear that the Loyalist dream for many migrants included enslavement. Regarding the outbreak of the revolution, Isabella notes, quote, "My earliest recollection was of hearing the violent political discussions about the Stamp Act and a lot of things which I had but very vague ideas." And I put in brackets, she was only a child after all. But then she continued, quote, "My father taking sides with the British, I of course considered the rebels to be a pack of thieves and robbers, without one redeeming feature." Now this reminds us that the American Revolution became a civil war, and participants on both sides came to view each other in a polarized black and white fashion. It also illustrates that many women, and particularly girls like Isabella and Hannah, had political allegiance and its repercussions thrust upon them due to the decisions of their male relatives. This doesn't mean that they lacked political opinions, but as children, their parents' views and allegiances were undoubtedly impressed upon them. The American Revolution disrupted many households. Families were split apart, either permanently or temporarily. And sometimes it was months, even years, before they saw family members again. Isabella notes that her mother died during the war, and her brother Ben went to Kentucky. Her father, she notes, hearing and getting assurance from the British authorities that Loyalists would get free grants in Nova Scotia, or Island St. John, as PEI was then called, made ready in the summer of 1783, which is actually 1784, and started to find a place. There was no regular mail to any place on the island but Charlottetown, and we got no word from him till late in the fall, when my brother received a letter describing the place Father had selected, and directing him to come and bring his sister Isabella as soon as in the spring as possible. Hannah's father, Benjamin, so now we're going to switch to Hannah for a minute. Hannah's father, Benjamin, was forced to flee the household due to his Loyalist leanings, and he joined a group of Loyalist partisans. On the 5th of October, 1776, Hannah witnessed the arrest of her father when she came home for a visit. He escaped 5 days later and returned to the partisans. When the onset of winter made hiding in wooded areas difficult, the partisans made their way to British-held territory, and there Benjamin enlisted in the King's American Regiment. Hannah recalls, Mother, whose name was Jerusha, was 4 years without hearing of or from my father, whether he was alive or dead. Anyone would be hanged right up if they were caught bringing letters. Oh, they were terrible times. The King's District Committee of Safety also arrested Hannah's 63-year-old grandfather, Benjamin, and sent him to Fleet Prison, aboard ships anchored in the Hudson River, where, like the other Loyalist prisoners, he would have been subjected to severe treatment. Hannah explains, they took my grandfather prisoner and sent him on board a prison ship. Mother rode 50 miles on horseback in 1 day when she heard it to go see him and take some money to buy comforts. He had a paralytic stroke when he was there, and he never recovered. Poor grandfather. On the 4th of October, 1777, Benjamin pledged allegiance to the United States and was released. After spending 7 years in the King's American Regiment, Benjamin made his way home when the regiment disbanded in 1783, and told the family that they were to go to Nova Scotia. As they prepared, the household was again suddenly surrounded by patriots, and Benjamin was again taken prisoner. Hannah's uncle tried to intercede, and this is Hannah's words, but no, and I take that to mean the intercession was not successful. But no, and I cried and cried, and I cried enough to kill myself that night. Now, I don't know whether she had suicidal thoughts, but it definitely was a very emotional memory for him. When morning came, Benjamin was released, and they packed up 5 wagon loads and traveled to the Hudson River, where they boarded the transport, and along with other disbanded soldiers of the provincial regiments, were evacuated from New York as part of the fall fleet that reached St. John, New Brunswick on the 4th of October, 1783. As Hannah noted in her memoir, I was just 11 years old when we left our farm to come here. She means New Brunswick. Isabella's and Hannah's accounts illustrate how revolutionary violence seeped into everyday life. Loyalists like the Ingrahams and the Robins experienced what historians call new levels of violence aimed at their person and property. Patriot forces often targeted female-led households, robbing, plundering, and confiscating property. Isabella notes, to give any idea of the misery and horror resulting from a hostile army occupying and quartering on the country is something hard to do. Often and well do I remember of 10 or a dozen at a time of rough fellows coming in and ordering dinner quick. And after getting it, they would carry off anything they took a fancy to. Sometimes a fat sheep, a bag of flour, or other provisions. I recollect once 5 or 6 fellows coming to the field where my brother Ben, a big resolute fellow, was plowing with a team of valuable horses, in which he took great pride. They ordered him to unhitch and give the horses to him. No, said Ben, if you take them over my dead body. And after some parleying and blasphemy, they went off. There's a wonderful sketch of that encounter in the exhibit if you want to take a look. And she continues, you can fancy how our nice place would go to ruin in 7 years of such as this. When Hannah's father was away, the Ingrahams' 93-acre property was confiscated. Hannah notes that the Patriots, quote, sold the things, plows and all, and my mother was forced to pay rent for her farm. What father had sown, they took away, but what mother raised after she paid rent, they let her keep. In the meantime, Jerusha and the children were constantly humiliated and threatened by American soldiers who, quote, used to fire at a tree and wish it was Ben Ingraham. The surveillance of women, children, and households more generally suggests that patriots viewed the women who stayed behind as a threat to American security. By the late 1770s and early 1780s, many states began to pass acts that not only banished male loyalists, but their wives. Soon statutes defining treason began referring to treasonous persons, which encompassed women, or he or she. So despite the legal tradition of coverture, which dictated that women's legal rights and identity were largely subsumed by her husband, female loyalists were conceptualized as dangerous political actors, and as persons, at least in terms of penalties. What of the voyage from their homes into exile? Isabella hints at the enormity of the trip from New Jersey to St. John's Island for young women of the 18th century. She says, to come from there to this colony at that time meant more than going to Australia now. However, we went about making preparations. At this time, I was only 16 years old. John, her other brother, found a vessel leaving New York in which we embarked in April 1784, which is actually 1785, and we had a fair passage. The vessel had to call at Passamaquoddy to discharge some cargo, where we were detained for 2 weeks which seemed to me like so many years. After leaving there, the weather was delightful, unlike today. And coming into the harbor of Bedeck, which was to be my residence for the remainder of my long life, on a lovely day in June, all nature looking its best, was most charming. The peculiar red banks along the island coast, in contrast with the somber gray of Nova Scotia, has been a subject of remark as we sailed along the Straits of Northumberland. But on nearing the land, after passing the low, thickly wooded place where the town of Summerside now stands, and the lovely green opposite that place, we sighted a clearance. Now, while there might be a little bit of romanticization in this description, as Isabella recalled this memory much later in life, I also suspect that after such uprooting experiences in the American colonies, seeing the natural splendor of St. John's Island and Bedeck was no doubt uplifting for the soul. Indeed, she does admit to needing some uplifting, to feeling rather sad during the voyage before seeing Bedeck. She says, "My brother thought, I suppose, to cheer my spirits, which had been pretty low during the voyage, by pointing to the place and saying, 'Father has selected a handsome place anyhow,' and by a good deal of light banter succeeded in getting me to acknowledge what I really thought. The place is very beautiful." Now, it's interesting to note that although she says John convinced her to acknowledge the beauty of Bedeck, she noted in parentheses that this is what I really thought. This is an important assertion of Isabella's, that young women such as her in the 18th century had their own thoughts and feelings. Other female loyalists had different experiences of the voyage into exile. Sarah Frost was a young wife and mother in Stamford, Connecticut, when the American Revolution broke out. In 1775, Sarah's father, Josiah Schofield, was a sergeant in the Continental Army, and her brother Gershom was also a patriot. But her husband, William Frost, was a loyalist. Thus, the townspeople forced them to flee for protection to the British lines, and they lived in a loyalist encampment at Lloyd's Neck during much of the war. On the 25th of May, 1783, William, Sarah, and their son began a 5-week migration into exile aboard the vessel Two Sisters. Sarah's diary, so again, here we have written words from the women themselves. Sarah's diary mentions the hardships involved in sailing with other families. This is from the diary. Monday, June the 9th. Our women all came on board with their children, and there is great confusion in the cabin. We bear with it pretty well during the day, but at night, one child cries in one place and one in another whilst we're getting them to bed. I think sometimes I will go crazy. She also mentions being unwell several times in the diary. For example, Friday, June 13th. Billy, and that's her name for her husband William, so there's a certain fondness there, I think. Billy gets up and gets breakfast, but I am unwell. I lie in my berth all day. He alters my berth in the cabin for me. Now, I initially attributed this to seasickness. However, we don't find out in the diary that she was actually 7 months pregnant while on this voyage. And upon reaching St. John, she gave birth to a baby girl. When they arrived in St. John, it was essentially a refugee camp. Sarah notes, "It is now afternoon and I have been on shore. I think it's the roughest land I ever saw." Now, I'm from St. John and I can attest to that. "We are all ordered to land tomorrow and not a shelter to go under." The experiences of Loyalist women and children in the Maritimes remind us that not only did they experience challenges in the war zone that they left behind, but in exile as well. Many of them lost family members. You'll recall Isabella's mother died during the war. And this is what happened when she arrived in Quebec. Quote, "As soon as our vessel was sighted, 2 young men came off the shore to meet us. When I thought it possible that my father was in the boat, my heart seemed to come to my throat. But I soon saw he was not there. I fancied those men's countenances wore a sad expression to welcome new arrivals. My brother inquired if they knew a man named Richard Robbins. 'Yes, but alas, he is dead,' they replied. If I had been struck in the head with an axe, the effect at that time could not have been more severe. Everything appeared to turn round, and I fell, but soon rallied. John tried to comfort me as best he could by assuring me we could return home." And this reminds us, I think, of the emotional toll of the loss a family member could have on young Loyalists like Isabella. So I quote, "I then learned that my father, the previous winter, in company with several others, had started for Charlottetown along the shore, and there was no road back then. There had been a snowstorm terminating with a silver thaw, which formed a crust, having water under the ice, which made it hard work to travel upon. My father, being a heavy man and not used to that kind of thing, gave out about a place now called Carleton. They concluded to return, and he traveled with them to Sea Cow Head, where he declared he could go no further." I actually visited Sea Cow Head. I just wanted to commune. "The men who were with him stuck to him for a good while and helped him along, but at last he prevailed on them to go and leave him. On arriving home, the only horse in the place was taken to bring my father, but they found him dead. He was buried in the field near where I was destined to live, and sometimes in my loneliness, the first 4 years of my residence here, I would take my work and sit on the grave." And again, there's a lovely sketch of that out in the exhibit. It is clear that Isabella missed her father for years after their arrival. Now, a number of the Loyalist women I'm profiling in my project also experienced the loss of family members during the war and in exile. Polly Dibble sailed from New York aboard the vessel Union in April 1783 and dropped anchor in St. John, New Brunswick in May. The family was optimistic, as her husband Filer's skills as a lawyer were in demand. He became a magistrate and was named a peripheral agent of the agents and directors which distributed town lots. However, the first winter was difficult for the Dibbles, as it was for many Loyalists. Filer had gone into debt, having borrowed money from neighbors and from Polly's younger brother, Munson Jarvis. Although the family enjoyed the wedding of their eldest son in the spring, Filer fell into a depression, probably due to several factors. His wartime experience as a Loyalist, debt, perhaps the shame of it, and maybe he feared a debtor's prison after his wartime imprisonment experience. Also, the agents and directors group was under scrutiny for misconduct. The dominant form of middling masculinity in this period dictated that men be financially solvent and support their families. So this pressure undoubtedly also contributed to his state of mind. There is evidence of other men in Quebec, for example, who suffered severe psychological strain due to worry about their families. Filer committed suicide on the 6th of May, 1784, leaving behind his wife and 6 children. According to a petition for financial assistance filed for Polly by her brother, and you see a copy of it on the screen, this is the explanation of what happened. Whilst the family were at tea, Mr. Dibble walked back and forth in the room, seemingly much composed. But unobserved, he took a razor from the closet, threw himself on the bed, drew the curtains, and cut his own throat. Polly's hardships were not over. A legal issue with Filer's estate was overshadowed by a fire that swept through St. John and burned down their house in 1785. Later that year, Polly received a land grant in Kingston, New Brunswick, and this is a picture of the church in Kingston. 2 of her adult children received lots near their mother, so Polly and her younger children built a log cabin there. She asked her brother William for financial assistance. Even though he was not financially secure himself, William helped Polly because, quote, she has suffered beyond the ability of human nature to bear. How she has lived is a mystery. He was concerned that Polly and the children in this log cabin were living on, quote, potatoes alone. Polly responded in November 1787, quote, I assure you, my dear Billy, that many have been the days since my arrival in this inhospitable country, that I should have thought myself and family truly happy could we have had potatoes alone. My children cry, Mama, why don't you help me and give me bread? O gracious God, that I should live to see such times under the protection of a British government, for whose sake we have done and suffered everything but that of dying. What a statement. Her brother Samuel, after visiting Polly's log cabin in 1788, described it as, quote, a miserable habitation, log hut, the ground was its floor, a fire in the center of the room, surrounded by the family instead of a chimney. It exhibited a scene of absolute poverty and distress. Perhaps because it lacked a chimney, the cabin also eventually burned to the ground in a fire. So that's her second fire. Suicide, 2 fires. Polly thereafter resided with her son Walter at Majorville, but then sailed up the Loyalist or St. John River to live in the Loyalist settlement of Woodstock with son William. Polly's hardships were not quite over. Her 29-year-old son Ralph passed away in 1799. Her eldest Walter died in 1817. Brother Munson died 8 years later. Polly passed away in May 1826 at the age of 79 in Woodstock. Resettlement could be a daunting process. Isabella tells us a little bit about the process on St. John's Island. I quote, the land, which was set apart for the Loyalists, at least the parts drawn by my father and brother, were at that time in a wilderness state. 50 acres for each bounded on the river and 25 acres backland, 7 miles distant without a road. And we now know that to be 450 acres of that. Isabella continues, they preferred taking leases from the proprietors in a place where the French Acadians had formerly inhabited, and had quite large clearings, small houses, orchards, and so on. John and I went into one of those houses. When I would be alone the first few winters, the bears would come and put their paws on the banking and look in the window. And for many years, it was difficult to raise sheep. Bears and wild cats were so numerous. It's interesting to reflect that this uprooted population of Loyalists took up land of another uprooted population, the Acadians. And it's really interesting to see an Acadian exhibit here too. And of course, there's the more general dispossession of indigenous peoples who formed part of Mi'kmaq. Isabella continues. John and I were both married near the same time, about 4 years after our arrival. Isabella married Benjamin Cole in 1787, and they settled close to Brother John on 200 acres on the south shore of Badek on Dunk River. It was not until 1792 that Ben received the deed from the proprietors on Lot 26. Brother John married Mary Hooper, eldest daughter of his Loyalist neighbor Thomas Hooper, they also hailed from New Jersey. Like Ben and Isabella, it was not until 1792 that the 100 acres they were living on was conveyed to them by the proprietors. In 1794, John appeared before the Legislative Council to request that the grant given to his father, his late father, be distributed to his descendants residing on the island. This was granted in 1803. Unfortunately, Isabella notes, my brother died in 1797, before this century, the 19th, commenced, and before he was 40 years old, leaving a family of 6 little children. Well, I lived to tell this story to my great-grandchildren. It must have been difficult to lose another family member with whom Isabella had experienced so much. What did she mean by the phrase, while I lived to tell the story to my great-grandchildren? Did she have survivor's guilt? Or is this a comment about fate? Probably the most disappointing comment in her account for me as an historian interested in women's history is the following. To tell the ups and downs of my life raising a large family would be uninteresting and commonplace. And that's all she wrote. Far from it, Isabella. It may have been commonplace for Loyalist refugee women to raise large families under challenging circumstances, but it is very interesting. How did you do it? And to conclude, I'll just mention a couple of women who did who did contribute to the survival of their families. Loyalist women responded to challenging circumstances in a number of ways. Elizabeth Green from New York was already a widow when she arrived in New Brunswick and had very little in the way of assets. Indeed, if you can take a look at the compensation claim here, you can see that she didn't really have very much to her name. A couple of beds, a pot and a kettle, and so on. Upon her arrival in New Brunswick, her son Isaac drowned in the Wolastoq or St. John River, and in 1789, 2 blocks of a land grant in the parish of Bright in York County, granted to herself and her other son Henry, were escheated due to lack of cultivation. But but she showed agency, petitioning the authorities for relief to help her family survive. Petitioning was a long-established British constitutional practice where subjects could appeal to government, but before the 1770s, it was almost unheard of for women to take an active political role in this way. Over time, however, many Loyalist women became more comfortable petitioning, often, quote, the real needs of their families, emboldening them to do so, according to one historian. She also engaged in another survival strategy. She remarried. On the 23rd of July, 1805, Elizabeth married Clayton Tilton, a Loyalist who had been granted considerable land holdings in Musquash, Lancaster Parish in St. John County. Elizabeth resided with her husband in Musquash until he was killed in October 1808 while attempting to apprehend deserters from the 101st Regiment. This left Elizabeth a widow the second time. Elizabeth was left with a small pittance from her husband's estate, probably because he had not updated his will since their marriage. To make matters worse, she was injured from a fall in the summer of 1809. Moving to the city of St. John, she petitioned the colony for relief, noting that if she were able to subsist, she would not be making such a claim. Thereafter, Elizabeth petitioned several times for relief, withdrawing one of the claims when Henry was able to assist her. The desire of Loyalists to be self-sufficient whenever possible was reiterated in the petition of 80-year-old Letty Bell of Burton Parish in the county of Sunbury, New Brunswick, who was in destitute circumstances. And like Elizabeth, she said, quote, as long as your petitioner was able to work, she was unwilling to get any aid. Beginning in 1823 until her death in 1827, Elizabeth made several consecutive claims for aid due to old age, the loss of her son Isaac, and her ailing health. In conclusion, it's clear that young and old female Loyalists experienced numerous obstacles. The American Revolution severely disrupted households, as family members could be separated for years at a time, with no news of whether their loved ones were alive or dead. Female householders, other relatives, and children were also subject to harassment and confiscation of property. And the challenges continued in exile, with the deaths of family members, natural disasters, and destitution. Now, it's important not to undervalue these hardships, but we must move beyond the stereotype of the, quote, stoic, long-suffering, self-sacrificial Loyalist female. Not only did women weep, that's the name of a book on Loyalist women in Upper Canada, not only did women weep, but they responded to violence and hardship by helping to form community bonds, ensuring the survival of their families, and contributing to resettlement. Ending with Isabella. We see upon her passing in 1855 that she left 11 children, 85 grandchildren, 144 great-grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. I would say that is an important and interesting legacy. Thank you.